welcome to the worm farm, Vermicomposting. This is the flip side of composting. If you don't mind having a more of a heavier price up front, I think for my setup it's $200. It's probably closer to $250, maybe $300 now. But for the amount of food waste here in the States, which averages out to be $1,200 a household, but that's from 2010. I expect it to be between $1,600 to $1,700 now. So I put that one-time investment down to gain that money back. So I'm still gaining, let's just say I'm gaining between $900 to, $1,500 a year. That's a pretty big size incentive. The only thing I have to worry about is making sure these composting worms, which in this case is a red wriggler, or some people call them tiger worms, their needs are being met. They're invertebrates, but I still treat them as livestock, which means I have to make sure they have enough food and water, and they're not getting too hot or too cold. Which their preferred ideal range is 60 degrees Fahrenheit to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Now the flip side of this, you don't want to add too much food at once. But there's various ways. I also have some tricks later in another video going more in depth with how to set up a worm farm. But what I'm doing is, because today's temperature is going to be 102, which I start going, that may be a little too hot for them. I'm going to start condensing these trays down. I also know I need to do some worm casting harvesting. I'm also going to find out how much of that I have. This turns out to be a lot more than I thought it was. And a good way to tell if they're hungry or not is if you open up the bin and you see the material is completely flat, yeah, they're hungry. Now, if you're interested in setting up a worm bin, what I would suggest is do some research, find out what you like. If you don't mind doing some more work to get the materials and save some money, you can make your own worm bin, or you can buy something like this, which already has that work set up. So, it's a lot easier. Depends what you want. You do need to buy the worms. You can't go out to the backyard, dig up a bunch of earthworms. Doesn't work. They don't like that. They're not even made to handle that type of material. So you're not getting around unless you have a composting pile for the last 20 years, you may be able to find some other regulars out there. But in this case, I had to buy mine. I first had to find out how much food I was wasting. For example, I literally had 1 pound of food going out the door every week. So I needed 1 pound of red wrigglers. That's how I keep the population in check. You need a 1-to-1 ratio of how many worms you have versus how much food you're doing. Then it's going to take 3 to 6 months for a first harvest to hit. These are living things. It takes a while for them to go. Once you get it set up, something like this, you come out once every month to do a harvest. Now, what's the benefit to the worm castings? If you were to buy a bag out here, last time I checked, 1 pound is equivalent to $5. So it usually comes in about a 3-pound bag. You may find something higher. The prices may have changed. But I'm also saving more money because now I'm using this as my fertilizer instead of buying a bag of synthetic fertilizer. It also holds its weight in water. This is it's 100% weight in water, which you will see, which you will more likely notice when I start doing the harvesting when I get done with this tray. Checking my gloves to make sure I don't have any worms sticking to my gloves, because I don't want them on my gloves. I want them in the bin, because the more worms I have, the faster they do their job, the more I get back into the garden. So if you're wondering about why I call it a low-grade fertilizer, well, I actually did a soil test. The pH is 7.6. It's a little high, but that's normal. but the NKP range is 1.3, 0.5, 1.2, and then that's me rounding up. But it's, like I said, it's a low grade. That's from the food waste, and you will have enough to fertilize your plants. I actually use this for my seed starts. Now you can see the worm castings. Now I'm going to check how wet this is, and you can see the worms there.
Yeah, this is going to be harvested.
I apologize for the camera since I'm still trying to figure out my best equipment to use. Now I'm going to grab a bucket just in case I have some escape artists. And I'm not going to use that bucket right away. It will come into play later. You see how it's sticking to my gloves? That's how much water it's holding. I can literally make a ball, clump that into a ball, and it will stick. Now you notice I'm spreading out the worm castings. I'm trying to get those worms to go into the bin below because they're photosensitive. So it's also a way where it incentivizes the worms to go deeper. Now the seed, they're going to naturally want to nosedive anyway. This is also a way I'm making the middle tray the working tray. It's this jargon for, that's where I have the bulk of the worms. You don't necessarily have to do that method, I just like that method. So I'll explain more of those deep in the same video where I go in more depth. And I also do the same method to the second bin. And if you're wondering what that bottom tray is, that's for the worm tea. Which I don't like using worm tea because it's more acidic base. Besides, there's easier ways to make worm tea, in my opinion. I got a sneeze coming on, so I'm trying to not sneeze on the live mic. Okay, I'm saved. Gotta love when a sneeze attack comes. Apologize for it being slow, but with this, I want to take my time. The reason why there's so much worm castings down there is because as the worms go up and down the tower, they actually drag some of that material with them. So I'm also trying to prevent that from overflowing. Now, a lot of people at this point would just dump a bunch of water in there and drain it. I don't want to do that. Because I know my worms, or a lot of my pet worms like to go rest in that area, so I do not want it to be that wet. I want them to be happy. I want them, when I have them happy, that means they're firing in our engines, they're doing the most amount of work. That's what I want. And I'm wanting to pull about half this material out to be harvested. You see how that one's just clumping? That's just how much water's in there. So imagine having that in a garden when you're trying to water it, it's 105 outside. That's also good for, you don't have to put that in the garden. You can use that for the lawn. It takes the lot. You can use that on ornamental plants. You can use that in trees, so this doesn't apply to the garden. But I'm willing to suspect I probably save about, with me, I would estimate between $1,500 to $2,000 a year on this by having this here. Now, like I said, this gets messy. It gets messy real quick. Now that's going to be my bottom tray. Now I'm actually going to add some grit in here because worms, like birds, don't have stomachs. They have a guzzard. So they need rocks to help grind up the material. And it can be sand. You can blend up egg cells. Just make sure you wear a respirator or a mask, because it's not ideal for health to be breathing in calcium. You can also use, in this case, I have a few boxes of fertilizer with trace minerals, crushed egg cells, as you see right there. And I'm going to add some trace minerals into that tray for the grit. You can also use some fat material that's designed to fatten up the worms as well. I don't have any of that. I don't really need it. Now I'm going to put the second tray, which is there. First I'm going to pull out these ice packs. That's what I use to help cool off the temperature. And I find those at Walmart for like reasonable price. You see I have newspapers in there. That acts as a screen from light, so it helps them. They're more willing to go up and feed because they feel like they're in a dark, protected environment. Because these creatures are nocturnal by nature. And there's my tower. That's going to be my working tray where I have the bulk of the materials in there, as you can see. And you actually see they're actually starting to chew on that newspaper. That's just straight from the garden. It was a bad piece of fruit. It has, bad pieces of fruits and vegetables, so I just throw it in there. They go to town on those items. I don't think about it ever again. You see what comes out. Now I'm going to do the same with this bin, which I have even more warm bins in there. Or assuming warm bins. I'm at the ice packs. Those I actually wrapped in some newspaper to help keep them cooler for longer. You see how I actually made that. I got some warm castings on there, as you see, not that big of a deal. That's the technique I use to help regulate the temperature inside the warm bin. Also, we'll add water back to the material. And I'm just going to flip that tray off, see what's going on at the bottom. This is why I brought that bin in. And you see that tray is ready to be harvested. Now at this point, I'm thinking, what's the best method for me to deal with that? So do I leave that there and just flip that in there? Which I actually thought was, then I realized, wait a minute, I have all this food in this. I want the worms back in this bin. Because that's what I do, I flip. When I harvest one bin, I flip into the other one. It's just more convenient for me. That's when I decided, hey, I wanted to put this in there, and I said, wait a minute. So that was just me wasting energy.
Actually, no.
Because I realized how much food is in there compared to the other one. So, like I said, it's just a rinse and repeat. But you also see how much worm castings that I have ready to be harvested and used for fertilizer. Now, I wasn't expecting this much in there, so that's a good thing. And when I do my seed starts, I will actually show you how I use these worm castings in that. And it's actually quite beneficial to have vermicomposting. I apologize. I'm still trying to find my footing here and what I want this channel to be. So, you know, these videos aren't exactly the greatest. But once I find my footing, that will take care of itself. And I'm just checking to make sure I don't have any loose worms. You have no idea how many times I've stepped on one of these guys. Now I'm just checking the rims because this stuff does, you see how it's still wanting to stick? That's how I know how wet it is, as I've said repeatedly. I cannot stress that enough. You see how much water it's holding. I don't want this to be lumpy because I'm trying to get all the worms to go deeper in the tray. What I'm going to do is, here in a few days, I'm actually going to do a video of me harvesting these worm castings and show you ways of how to shift the worm castings. Because it's so wet, I have to let it dry out first. Like, that's actually a remnant of a tea bag. You see, like, that's a good example of how wet it is. It just clumps. So again, for that 200, I'm just going to say for now, I'm just going to say 250 for sake of argument with current inflation. And I'm getting what? Say 1750 back is what I think. I have not tracked the actual numbers, so don't quote me. That's a very good investment. Now I'm going to go underneath here to see what's going on here, which I expect more of the same. Now I'm just making sure I don't squash any worm guys there. And you see more of the same here. So I might pull more material out of there, which I believe which means gives me a full tray to harvest for. When I do that harvest, I'll actually have a scale that you can see, well, I guess I decided not to. So don't quote me too much. Sometimes I don't even know my own methods. I think what I decided to do was was a bit on the low side, so I wanted to fill up some more before I came back in and harvested. Now I'm going to reduce the amount of material in there. Because what I'm going to do when I do my harvest from the next tray, it's going to flip into that can. You see how the worms already start to degrade or eat away at that tomato. Because the idea here is I'm harvesting, so I want to reduce that tray so I can put the tray on top of it where it slots in better to keep the worms from wanting to escape, as well as to incentivize them going, or staying in that tray. That's what I'm trying to say. Or constantly moving into that. That's the reason why you notice that I've left some stuff in there. I removed all the big chunks. Now, what I will do in the future is I'll just move the top tray and my materials back, my food scraps back into that bin, and encourage them to stay down there. Now, I don't need to have newspaper on top of that bin because, one, it's going to cause some temperature fluctuations, which I don't want. So I'm just going to draw the newspaper back in there. I'm trying to decide where I want to put these ice packs. But I have to add the grit back into those 2 bins, or trays, whatever, before I proceed. That will also encourage the worms to go down in those bins to get the grit. And again, anytime, as long as it's like a material they can grind up, this is typically harder than the rest of the food, you're fine. And I use trace minerals because it helps balance the worm castings out a little. You don't necessarily have to. You can use sand. And you see how that newspaper is just ready to crumble. That will form a nice little layer of protection. Will encourage the worms to come out and help eat. And then when it gets colder, having a newspaper on like that, for say, will add about 10 degrees. But right now I'm not worried about that because it's the middle of summer. It's getting summer, it's getting hot, so I don't need to have that type of material in there. So I'm going to shred this up as I'm doing, covering all the parts up. That also becomes like a slow wicking. So this is over the material will absorb the water and release at a slow pace and help regulate the water control so it doesn't get flooded, it also won't get as hot. However, what I am going to do is, since that's the working tray, I'm going to add the ice packs to that tray instead of the top tray. And I'm going to wrap the ice packs in more newspaper to keep, because the worms will when you get too hot, they will rest up against the ice packs to cool off. So by me putting plenty of newspaper on there, that will act as a barrier. And it's also going to, when I put that bin on top of the other bin, it's also going to raise up that bin enough where when I turn the fan on, it's going to allow air to get inside there to help circulate that cool air, because that's basically, at this point, I'm creating what we call a heat sink. The hot air is going to rise, it intermingles with the cold air is going to sink back down. And since they're not going to have so this, constantly circulates. The other reason why I'm wrapping so good is I hate having to clean these off. And if you're wondering, I found those ice packs at Walmart. If you're wondering where I got those from. See, I'm double layering that because I don't want to have. I really hate cleaning these things off in end of the day. And it also will help absorb the excess of water. So now it just wicks. Now, if you have a worm bin inside the house, you don't have to worry about this. Something I should bring up: the can there, the cylinder, as I call it, does not get as hot as the rectangular for whatever reason. So I have to focus on putting more of my efforts in cooling that bin off more than I do with the can. I guess because of the site, how much mass is in there. Once I get done wrapping this, the tray, worm castings go in there. You see it's kind of has a little raised up because I'm wanting more air to come in there, since there's cool air. Then I put the lid back on. I forgot to check the bin. There's a couple worms in there, so I'm trying to figure out what's the best way to get the worms out. That stuff I decided to toss in there, toss in that bin, the little container, because I can always add the water and it turns into worm tea, as we call it. Now I'm going to get the 2 worms in there. As you see, I have trouble grabbing, so I'm just going to knock them loose. Dump the whole bucket in there. Double check. Now, then I put the lid on. Relocate the fan, which I've edited it out, and turn the fan on to keep it cooler. But I don't slide the lid on all the way. I want it cracked so it gets some airflow in there. Now in the winter time, yeah, I will have this closed down. I'm just making sure I don't have any worms on the floor, because I'm not seeing any, checking any